Yeah, it's tired from everyone using it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think this is like the hot time for like teachers using it.
Oh
So
yeah, for sure.
their students.
Hmm.
So, all right. So you were just getting to the intermittent fasting. You described that it was the 16 to 20 hours, and then you kind of got to where time restricted feeding, and that's right where it cut off.
Okay.
So if you want to kind of pick back up there.
Sure. So, time restricted feeding is technically a term underneath and within intermittent fasting because it's a eating pattern where food intake is restricted to an eating window, and it can typically be 8 hours of eating. This many hours you're fasting, or you're eating for 10 hours and you're not eating for this many hours. So, that I think is more characteristic of Ramadan just because they have a certain time restriction in which they're allowed to fuel, and it is limited to those hours after between sunrise and sunset. So I think that's more of what describes what happens during Ramadan.
And then just to add to that, like during like a someone not practicing Ramadan, they probably will drink water and maybe have like caffeine or gum, things like that. And practicing Ramadan, you can't always have water or like take anything in. And they're also like practicing like a different level of mindfulness on like really appreciating when they have food and different things like that. It's kind of like a mindfulness that you might not have if you're not practicing Ramadan.
John, are you still doing the no breakfast, no lunch thing? Just coffee?
Well, yeah. It's funny, we talk about we're in the middle of this pandemic right now, and my eating and sleep habits are literally all over the board. Where I've pushed off breakfast still. There's been times where I have eaten breakfast. I've gotten back into the habit of doing it again, but I'm still trying to do time restricted feeding. But I know once everything kind of goes back to normal, it'll be easier for me to do that. I think I've just allowed myself to not adhere to such a strict time restricted eating or fasting. But yeah, I have done that, and it is a practice of mine.
Yeah, it's common. I know Melanie and I were just talking yesterday, and this concept more of time restricted feeding itself in the diet form is probably going to be more familiar to our athletic trainers and maybe our athletes' parents, just because we never recommend our athletes doing any type of dieting whatsoever. That is not what they need at all. So it has been shown to be beneficial though for people who are either trying to lose weight or just kind of reset their metabolic inside, basically.
So let's discuss hydration.
Mm-hmm.
This could be a very difficult thing, and we started touching on it a little bit. How do we go about helping our athletes that are practicing the time restricted fasting, time restricted eating, because they can't take water in? And there's times where even if you are fasting and you try not to allow yourself to drink water, you can wet your mouth, things like that. Or chew gum, candy, something to help you a little bit. How do we help athletes that are practicing fasting? How do we help them hydrate?
So I think were we talking about like athletes practicing Ramadan? So once they're able to hydrate, taking advantage of drinks that optimize hydration. So we know that some beverages are better at hydrating than just plain water. For example, there's been studies that looked at milk, juice, like sports beverages, and specifically the milk and orange juice were a little bit better at hydrating than just plain water. So awareness of that could be helpful once they have like they're during a period where they can have those beverages, and then even like considering salting food or having saltier foods can help with retention of water. And then with hydration, like awareness of signs and symptoms of dehydration, I think is so important for coaches and the athlete to be aware of, which I'm sure you've seen with your athletes, like knowing the signs like urine color, weights before and after practices, or even like before you go to bed and when you wake up. And any quick weight loss is typically reflective of like losing water, dehydration. So like losing 2% or more of their body weight could indicate that they're dehydrated.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then again, going back to Melanie's point earlier, just having that plan when they're able to break fast of how much they're going to be drinking and when. Because again, they don't want to go slug a bunch of water right when they're allowed to, because then that's going to take that space up where they need to get that fuel in. So utilizing again those drinks like Melanie said, like water and juice, and maybe making smoothies. There was a study that looked at soccer team, Saudi Arabian soccer team, and one of the techniques they used was using something like, they called it milkshakes, but it was basically a smoothie with protein and fluid and milk and fruit, which is also hydrating. Vegetables are also hydrating. So incorporating a lot of those types of things into something like a smoothie, so it's very energy dense and it's not a large amount. Potentially doing something like that, as well as either one of their meals, one of their snacks, incorporating that as some of their hydration in addition to like that milk, that juice. And those things are going to have those calories and some of those macronutrients that they're going to need to get in a short period of time.
And then also we're going into like hotter weather now. Mm-hmm. And so having them be aware of like ways to cool down your body, like during practice, maybe having like cold towels or ice. Although they're not taking in that water, just cooling down their body should reduce like the impact of dehydration. Mm-hmm. They can keep themselves cool.
Yeah, that was one of the things that when I was discussing this with my athletes last year and putting together that paper, was the idea of cooling their body. Just having the cold towels, having the ability to get into a shaded area or coming inside during practice, that helped them kind of restart, focus on why they were doing it, because it is a religious practice, and allowing them to be closer to their God or to God. So they needed that time to focus as to the reason why they were doing it. And allowing them to just cool themselves off, sit, think, meditate. That allowed them to kind of return back to their sport within a little bit quicker time frame, rather than just worrying about needing to get water or whatever it is. Having them focus on the reason why they were doing it, and then allowing them to go back at their own time frame. That was one of the considerations that we had talked to with our coaches about, was to allow the athletes to excuse themselves, step away, cool themselves down, and go forth with what they needed to.
Did you?
So I got something. You were talking about the practicing the intermittent or the time restricted feeding. So does that change the spiritual aspect if you start 2 or 3 weeks before the event, before Ramadan starts, start practicing your time restricted feeding or doing that? So do you think that changes that for the athletes at all? And maybe in your experience as you've asked them to do that before, kind of.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, most of them, they understand why they have to do it, but again, we're still talking about kids who are teenagers. And so if this is something that's going to help them maybe get better, they're willing to try it, to do some of these things. Obviously, they're not going to sit down and have that iftar meal or that suhoor meal with their families at those certain times, but just starting some of those habits of maybe we start taking naps during this time. Maybe we're really focused on trying to stay awake a little bit later than we're used to, and then we're sleeping between these hours. So just little changes over time, because we can't just ask them on the dot, like, okay, let's start practicing, like everything we need to do. So just little changes over time, because we can't just ask them on the dot, like, okay, let's start practicing, like everything we need to do. So just little changes over time, because we can't just ask them on the dot, like, okay, let's start practicing, like everything we need to do. So little by little, that'll help that transition to when it is April 23rd, that they're able to maybe just have a little bit better habits or do things a little bit better. Maybe it's the fact that they're not as dehydrated as they would be or they have been in the past. Maybe it's that they feel like they have a little more energy during the day compared to years past. So if there's anything we can do like that to help them, then hopefully they're able to do that. And I haven't really had anybody say like, oh, that's not allowed. We're not allowed to practice that, just because it's little habits that we're asking them to change, not necessarily the entire fast itself. So.
And another thing to keep in mind too is that there are a lot of athletes that choose to hold their own Ramadan at a different time frame.
Yep.
I've had athletes start and they'll do it for a week or so, maybe 10 days, and then realize that they're unable to keep up with the habit of fasting during their athletic time, and they'll push it off until the end of the season. That is allowed. And there are times where they need to be medically treated. So say you do have somebody that goes down with a heat illness and they need to be drinking water, or say they have to go to the hospital and they're forced with IV fluids, things like that. They can take that time frame where they had to be treated and push that off to another time frame, maybe at the end of Ramadan. So say they last for 2 weeks and they still have 2 weeks left. They can use that 2 weeks at the end of their athletics. The whole point of it is to bring them closer to God and to practice fasting and kind of, why they're doing it. So the time frame is it's mandatory for those that can do it. For those that cannot do it, they are allowed some leeway with planning their days. And I know we talked about this last year too. For women who are menstruating, they are allowed to push that week off for another time. So it's not always that full-time month time frame. They can push it off for other times. So that is something to keep in mind for those athletes that are practicing the time restricted feeding.
Yeah, and I know at Michigan too, we had some athletes who their parents or they had talked to their whoever their leader was in their church they attended, and they gave them kind of permission to drink water during the day. They were able to consume fluids, but maybe not food. So there are different levels, I think, and I think it all depends too on the family, on the church, on that individual, their beliefs. And so it's hard to kind of make, again, blanket statements about it because everyone does it a little bit differently. Because, yeah, I have worked with athletes. They're like, yeah, my priest or rabbi told us we're able to drink water during the day because they know I participate in sports and they gave me a blessing to be able to do that. But they still participated in the no food. So there is, I know that I've seen as well.
Yeah, and just to go off that, I think like the first thing we would do when working with them is ask them like, how do you interpret Ramadan and like how do you usually go about it with your family? Do you want to be mindful of them?
Yeah, and that's I really enjoy that point right there. It's really connecting with those athletes, really connecting with them and asking them what they need. We don't always want to have everybody's input, but when you are being considerate, when you're showing compassion and asking those questions, those athletes are much more apt to come up to you during a practice and say, hey, I need a few minutes to myself right now. And they're able to excuse themselves. But when you're doing that, you're opening up those lines of communication that will help extremely during Ramadan. But after Ramadan too, the athlete's going to trust you more as a practitioner, as an athletic trainer, as a coach. They're going to trust you more with decisions that you have to make or that you suggest. And that's one of the important things. And that's kind of why we're here too, is to educate ourselves, but to help us connect with our athletes better so that we're better healthcare providers for them.
Yeah. And I think taking also like their health and safety is kind of like our main point here. And then like once we have that like focus on, okay, what can we do to make sure you're maintaining performance and energy, but definitely make sure they're healthy and safe. And I'm sure that's what their parents also would like too. So I want to take that into account.
Yeah, and I spoke with our local community about it last year, and the thing that they wanted to emphasize is that health and safety is always the number one priority. Yes, this is an important practice. Yes, this is an important pillar of their faith. However, if there's ever any compromise to the health and safety, it needs to be stopped and treated immediately. And that was the main point that they wanted us to understand and the coaches to understand, is that yes, we can treat, yes, we can help if we feel that there is an emergency to take care of. And the athlete can adjust those days at the end, but to keep the person alive and healthy and safe, that is the number one thing that we need to keep in mind.
Do you, in your athletes, do you find that they're aware of like hydration, knowing if they're dehydrated or knowing if they have like low blood sugar? Do they know the signs and symptoms?
Yeah, it's the older athletes, so the juniors, seniors that have practiced it 2-3 years. They're really good at knowing their bodies, knowing the signs and symptoms, knowing how to eat, how and when to eat. It's the younger ones that need a little bit more guidance. And like I said, last year when I put this out, it opened up all of our athletes to help or to communicate with us and to ask those questions. Because in the past, even though Islam is the number 2 religion in the world, they still felt kind of isolated and they didn't know who to ask those questions to, or they didn't feel comfortable asking those questions. So, when they have the people around them that are aware of their religion, aware of those practices, they were much more apt to ask questions. So the older ones, yes, they could figure those things out. It was the younger ones that were kind of out in the woods by themselves and didn't know where to turn.
Do you guys do? Oh, sorry, Melanie.
Go ahead.
John, do you guys do anything like a meeting or like paperwork or anything like that kind of before this time period starts, just to I guess come across the way you are right now? Like, we're here for your athlete, we want to make sure, again, their health and safety is our priority. Can we talk about like each athlete, or have the parents or something like that? Do you guys do anything like that?
So last year was the first year that we did something. In the years past, it was very, very informal. I had always tried to become a little bit more educated with that, because our population of our student athletes, I knew there was a lot more Muslim athletes there. So I tried to be a little bit more. It wasn't until our superintendent and our administration asked for me to put something together to help educate our coaches and put it out into our community that really opened up the door for our athletes in our community. The outreach from them when this got put out was tremendous, and I'm so glad that we were able to do this for our community. But up until then, it was very informal. So this is out, like I have it available for people if they want it, to put it out for their student athletes, their communities, because it really helped me connect with our student athletes and the student athletes that I didn't know were Muslim. And, I just didn't know that they would be going through this time period and needing help. So if I'm more aware of those things, it made me a better athletic trainer for our students.
Yeah, and just like having the support too. I know high school by itself is really hard. So during this time, just having the trainer and support staff there in case they need them, I'm sure it was helpful for them.
Yeah, and one of the cool things is when I sent it out, the first group I sent it out to was our coaches. So it was our coaches that, since they are with our athletes more in those teams, the first person I got it back, the first email I got back from was our lacrosse coach, was our boys lacrosse coach. And if you've ever seen this guy, he's He's an old football player, played at Michigan back in the 60s. So he's just this rough, gruff, older white male. And he was the first person to reach out to me and say, thank you so much. I really needed this because I didn't know how to communicate with those athletes. And, I figured it would be our younger coaches that were like, hey, this would be great. Thanks. Thanks for the information. But when I knew that I was reaching out to that coach that was struggling to communicate with his athletes and understand, that's when I knew we were opening up more doors for everybody.
Yeah, so with hydration, I would just going up some more nutrition points for them, just to help them know what to do when they are hydrating and refueling. Kyla and I were talking about how I just kind of jumped back into nutrition, but there are a couple of points. I think you're talking about how the nutrition composition of their meals change in addition to hydration. So I don't know if they would be interested in that and just some things that they can do to refuel. We can talk about that more.
Yeah, I think that's really important to discuss. How should an athlete, since they are in a time restricted eating time frame, how should they go about adjusting those meals, and what are the most important things for them to recognize when they're putting food into their body?
So I think the first thing, like we do with any of our high school athletes, is educate them on how different foods impact how they feel and their energy. So some of the research and articles have looked at focusing more on carbohydrates and protein during a time restricted feeding for Ramadan. And the carbohydrates, mainly those are they're found in grains, breads, fruits. And we know that carbs give them energy. So if they have their sports practice during the day and they're not eating, by the time they get that meal in, we want to make sure we're refueling that energy burned. So getting extra carbs in will be helpful just to optimize energy. And then also protein. We know when you go long spans of time without eating, and if you're in maybe an energy deficit, so we're not getting all the calories we need, your muscle mass and fat-free mass could decrease a little bit. So making sure we're increasing our protein and getting adequate protein will also help preserve some of their muscle mass. So carbs and protein, and then fat actually decreases a little bit just because we're needing a little more carbs to replenish fuel. So I don't know, Kyla, do you have anything to add to that?
Just kind of those basic recommendations, as far as specific numbers, because I know people like numbers. They're like, okay, carbs, protein, yes. But I know with carbs, again, as Melanie said, the papers we looked at really emphasize high carb refeeds is what we call them. So those periods when they're able to eat, they're trying to refeed their body, refuel their body after the day they've just had. I know some of the papers have recommended about 6 to 8 grams per kilo of carbs, which I'll kind of give you an example here in a second. And as far as protein goes, they say it's about 1.8 to 2 grams per kilo of protein during that time. Now, if you think about it, so you're like, okay, I have the numbers, I know what foods are what, but what does that look like? So let's say we had a 220-pound athlete, because I'm making my math easy. So they're about 100 kilos. During a regular day, so when they're not fasting, let's say they need anywhere between 5 to 7 grams per kilo worth of carbs. So let's say about 500 grams of carbs. For protein, we'll put them at about 2 grams per kilo. So that's about 200 grams of protein. So what does that look like food-wise? Protein, that's about 1.25 pounds of meat. And that looks like about 33 slices of bread, just in general. So that amount of food that they would need in a whole day, cram that in now into that nighttime feed. So if you kind of see where I'm going with this, it's really difficult. The recommendations and what we're asking them to try to do in order to, again, optimize their nutrition. Are they going to be able to get that much? Maybe, maybe not. But we want to do our best, again, giving them those tools, giving them education, giving them ideas of things they can do to maybe just increase those calories and get those numbers a little bit closer to what they need to be to hopefully attenuate that weight loss, your fat-free mass loss, that they're not as dehydrated during the day, and that maybe they feel a little bit better during the day. So it is a lot that we would recommend or ask. But again, it's all about the education and communication with them and teaching them those things that they need.
And just
so on that, you guys mentioned the having like a protein or milkshake kind of thing. And then, but we've also talked about hydration. So if they're filling up with water, then that leaves less room for them to fill up with the cramming in all that food. So how do you recommend them not drinking much water, but making sure they get that hydration through the fruits and vegetables, or making sure that it is just those smoothies? Or like, how do you balance that out?
Yeah. Melanie had made a good point about the different hydrating foods, but just quickly before I give it to her, both, doing both those things, water and some of those more hydrating fluids and things like smoothies. So Melanie.
Yeah, if they can do even orange juice or milk in place of water, they'll get the calories, macronutrients, and it was found that those were more hydrating than just plain water. The carbs in it help you in the sodium and everything in it helps retain water a little bit better. So your body's able to absorb more fluid. It slows down how you absorb the fluid. And then also on that, if you're getting in the smoothies or a shake, it's not like you're eating so much food. I know from talking to a couple athletes that when you're getting in these huge meals and then you might go right to bed, that's a lot for your body to have to digest and then go to sleep. So they might experience stomach aches and maybe some GI upset just from digesting it all. So using something like a smoothie before bed rather than that big meal, or if they're waking up at 2 a.m., using some type of easy to digest food that's high in calories and hydration could be something for them to try out different smoothies or protein shakes and get a little creative with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you can easily make a 500 to 600 calorie shake super easy, and it could be 8 to 12 ounces, and they could drink that super easy. And asking them maybe to drink something like that or eating all the food that's going into it, they're going to see that shake as probably a little bit easier thing to do. And again, they're getting in probably more fruit, more veggies than they would otherwise if you're putting that into a shake. So you can sneak in some stuff too.
Now, how do we adjust? Now we're learning a lot, and we're figuring out, especially the macronutrients and where to emphasize what we need to put into our body. How do we adjust for some food allergies? So let's talk about, you talked about the 33 slices of bread. Let's talk about somebody who is a celiac patient.
Mm-hmm.
How do we help with that?
Yeah, rice, potato.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Those are typically low in food allergies. And then fruit, of course, they can get their carbohydrates from fruit.
Yeah, it'll just be adjusting again the types of foods that they're eating, because not all carbs have gluten in them, which is a nice thing. So maybe not 33 slices of bread, but instead we're looking at 16 potatoes or something like that. So we can always, alternate whatever it is that we're asking them to eat. So.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Good. Now, I talked about when I wrote this letter last year, one of the 3 things that I wanted to emphasize was sleep. How does time restricted feeding and how does a diet like this affect sleep?
A lot of the studies did note that sleep was one of the factors that, if you're changing the time you're eating, it changes your body clock, and that automatically can impact sleep. And especially like when you're eating, that's telling your body like, okay, it's time to be awake right now. Same thing like when it's light or dark out. So eating is also one of those factors that can throw off your body clock. So I think a big one would be looking at types of foods you're eating. So if we're eating something like a Thanksgiving dinner, like really high in fat and sugar, that could kind of like upset your stomach and then make it hard to fall asleep. So kind of what we just mentioned with the shakes, that could be something. I'll let Kyla give her input too.
Yeah, sleep is one of those things, again, especially during Ramadan, that is going to be the biggest factor, they say, that's going to impact how, not even just that athlete, how that person feels for the rest of the time. I've seen, obviously not high school athletes, but adults who actually work, whatever job it might be. They completely flip their schedules. They tell their bosses, I'm going to work between this time and this time, and it's at night. And then during the day, they sleep all day. So they're completely kind of that night shift now. So they've completely shifted their entire day. And something like that, again, as Melanie mentioned, our body clock and our circadian rhythms are going to be thrown off for sure. It's, again, something that unfortunately we have to learn how to strategically structure sleep during this time, because eating when we're supposed to be sleeping can lead to just a slew of different things. Unfortunately, our insulin and glucose control is going to be a little thrown off. Our sleep efficiency when we do sleep is going to be a little thrown off. Our cortisol levels, our leptin levels, so things like that. Metabolically, our body's going to struggle just because it's internal, that circadian rhythm is thrown off. So again, doing what we can and helping them schedule. They maybe are sleeping at some point during the night, but then they're taking naps during the day strategically in order to just supplement however many hours of sleep they were able to get that night.
And then also, I know a lot of kids will like energy drinks and caffeine. So letting them know that if they have those hours before bed, that's also going to make it even harder to fall asleep. So just like general sleep hygiene tips would
keeping
be
the room cool. Yep, keeping the room cool, making sure when they're awake during the daytime, they're getting that exposure to light. Again, to maybe bring some normality to their sleep-wake cycle. Yeah, for sure. And no energy drinks. Please don't.
And then also like weighing it out, like worth it to wake up at 2 a.m. and eat something, or should I just not like wake myself up and keep sleeping? So maybe looking at their training schedule or competitions, and if they have a big competition coming up, then letting them sleep a little bit, because we know that'll help with recovery and performance. So I think that's one of those individualized factors where we can plan it out based on what they have going on.
So let's give it our number one tip for athletic trainers to help treat our athletes during this time. What would you say your number one tip would be?
Know your athlete. Talk to them, get to know them, again, build that rapport with them, so you're better able to communicate and have that relationship with them, because a big part of this is, again, that they're wanting to be closer to their God, and it is a big mental challenge for them. So even just having that kind of relief by having someone to talk to and who maybe understands is going to be very beneficial. So educating yourself, reaching out to Melanie or myself with questions, reading up on it. And yeah, that would be the biggest, I think, tip just in general.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And then also educating them on signs and symptoms of dehydration, like if they're noticing their health is declining, like letting them know like it's important to tell their trainer and their coach that. So letting them know those points, and then possibly helping them plan ahead of time if they need help with planning. So we know, like, okay, carbs and protein and hydration are really important. Now, maybe here's some of the things to try, keep their health up.
Okay.
All right. So what we'll do now is we'll give a chance for you to give your information out so that people can contact you. So while you guys get that ready, every time John's on, we always talk about Myotech, because that's his people right there around the corner. So I know they're working hard during this current COVID-19 to help get masks and things like that. And also during March, which was National Athletic Training Month, they donated some tape that I'm going to be sending out, some cases of their new tape. So if you want to check out Myotech, it's SMB, thesportsmedicinebroadcast.com/myotech, and you can use the code TheSMB. So using the code TheSMB on myotechstore.com or sportsmedicinebroadcast.com/myotech. All right, so Kyla, if somebody wants to get a hold of you, what's the best way to do that?
Yeah, you can send me an email, and that email is kykross@umich.edu. And I check my email all the time, so I should be able to get back to you relatively quickly.
Okay. And Melanie, if somebody wants to get a hold of you?
It would also be my email. It's a little long, but it's my first name, Melanie, dot my last name, BATTAGLIA, @memorialherman.org.
Okay. And so I want to thank Brett Singer for connecting us. Again, Brett's been on the podcast multiple times, and it's really just a great opportunity for students, for people working in their fellowship, to kind of get in front of public and ask questions, but also to share their knowledge. And so, Brett, thanks for hooking us up. John is still got his COVID-19 email autoresponder set up. So, John, what's the best way for someone to get a hold of you?
Email jciecko@bloomfield, BLOOMFIELD.org. So jciecko@bloomfield.org, or on Twitter at JOHNCIECKO.
And so for me right now, it's probably email info@sportsmedicinebroadcast.com, because I'm trying to stay signed out of social media on my phone so that I don't spend all the time just looking at the phone or getting distracted with that. So if you need to get hold of me that way, this is sportsmedicinebroadcast.com/Ramadan. Again, sportsmedicinebroadcast.com/Ramadan. So I'll have the links, I'll have this kind of a summary written there, ways to contact those each of the participants today. So for Jeremy, John, Kyla, Melanie, and the Sports Medicine Broadcast, that is a wrap. Thanks.